Station 51, engine 27, engine 32, truck 105.
You're listening to The Fire Break with Steve Wolf. Welcome back to The Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. As you know, The Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire, developing innovative technology for the wildfire market. Speaking of innovative technology, I don't know how to use most of it, honestly. And it's just slightly ahead of me is Barb Wolfson, who's joining me today. And we're both finding ourselves a little bit technically challenged this morning, but we're going to get through it because that's what we do. Welcome to The Fire Break. How are you today, Barb?
I'm good, thanks.
Good. So tell me what you're working on these days.
My primary two things of my job are research and outreach. I do Cooperative Extension on the Central Coast of California for the University of California. And so I do, my research is generally ecologically based, but I'm also potentially starting up some projects with some local tech folks who you may have heard of, called BurnBot. I'm going to potentially look at, put in some plots before they put in their black line and kind of look at what comes back. There's some, observational anecdotal evidence of a landowner I know who had BurnBot on her property and said, I feel like there are more flowers, I feel like there are more natives where they put in their black line rather than the broadcast burn that we did. So I'm going to try to look at that once we can get together.
So what would the theory be there, that a little bit of fire creates a good spot for flowers to grow, but a lot of fire kills all the things that would have turned into flowers?
Sometimes, I mean, it does depend, totally dependent on the ecosystem. Some lodgepole pine, for example, up in the mountains, their whole purpose is to burn hot. They have serotinous cones. That's a stand replacement system. There are some stand replacing systems. I mean, really, even, Southern chaparral is a stand replacing system. It grows back like crazy, even after really hot fires. So it is dependent on the ecosystem. We do have a little of that on the Central Coast, but a lot of what we have on the Central Coast, especially the grasslands, do great after a light fire.
Okay, so we often hear about wildfires and people say, so many acres were destroyed, right? As far as I can tell, if you look either at it in person or from the satellite, the acre is still there, right?
This is true. I do. Destroyed is actually one of my pet peeve words for the media. And I have had, some discussions with some of the journalists that I know personally about that word and the use of that word. I also think acres is not a good metric because people think, there are 50,000 acres burned. Well, no, not all of those 50,000 acres burned, and not all of them burned at the same severity. We have, once we get our severity maps from, our GIS and remote sensing, and we ground truth it, then we have some idea of what burned, what didn't burn, at what severity, and then we can kind of make some decisions, in terms of what to do next, and also just decide how, good and bad the fire was and what areas.
I see. And how do you impact the words that the media uses to try to bring them more in line with real science and for a little further away from the sensationalism?
When I get interviewed, I am very particular about my word choice, but I often sometimes discuss that with them too. I will specifically say the acres that you get, or even when they talk about square miles, which seems like a really strange metric to me, but I work in acres. So, but I think square miles is something that the general public maybe understands better. But, I have actually said that to journalists. Please be sure to say that not all those acres maybe, might not be burned. So, just to be clear to people so that people get what's going on, because it does sound like a lot when you say 50 square miles were burned or whatever, or destroyed. And the public says, oh my gosh, I'm never going to be able to go back to that area. I love to recreate there. I can't go there now. It'll be destroyed. And as you know, that's not the case,
right?
And even in, a high severity system, things grow back. It may not be what it was, it may be converted to a shrubland from a forest, but it still comes back. It just takes time.
Right. And before your house there, a volcano was there. It's just a matter of, whether you're willing to look at that geological time frame.
Yes.
Right. So what are the things, what are you seeing now that's different than what you saw when you started studying this field?
There definitely is more high severity fire in places where it wasn't before. There are bigger patches of high severity fire. I spent 20 years in the Southwest, so I'm certainly a lot more familiar with that area in terms of long-term impacts and long-term change. And, the Grand Canyon, for example, they've had several areas reburn, and this is not related to the current fire, but just over time they had, a fire, say in 2000, and then 5 years later it reburned. And, it was a higher severity. There was there were down trees from the previous fire, and so they ended up with these shadows of giant logs that had fallen, that burned. And, not much grows in those areas when you have 1,000-hour fuel that has burned completely and been completely consumed because the soil got so hot in that one spot. Weeds and invasive species come back there. So, they've had a lot of management challenges just in terms of thinking, okay, well, once this area burns, then we're good for a while. And that kind of was historically the case. We'd have small fires that were either caused by lightning or indigenous peoples historically, and it would be low severity, and then it would be good for a while, and that's just not as much the case as it used to be. It's things are reburning more frequently than they should as well.
So are a sufficient number of fuels regenerating that quickly to offer new fuels for the reburn?
There is often, like in the ponderosa pine system, there is often a flush of small trees. The small trees aren't super flammable unless we're in really dry conditions, which of course there is more of that now. There a lot of people like to point to climate change as a primary factor, which it is a primary factor, but there are so many other factors as well, like the regeneration, like the downed trees that weren't completely consumed in the first fire. And so then that's this huge jackpot of fuel on the ground. And, maybe it's not 5 years, it's probably more like 10 to 15 years that you get a reburn in the Southwest. But it's happening more, more so now. And then I remember there was a fire in December, which was really strange in the Southwest. It was a dry year. There wasn't any snow on the ground yet. And to me, I just remember thinking, what? I've never seen a fire in December. And I think that was before the Marshall Fire. That was before some of these other ones that we've seen. And it was out on the forest. It didn't threaten any structures. There was no infrastructure that was threatened. It wasn't, a huge deal in that respect, but it was still kind of eye-opening because it was new. It was, why are we burning in December? That's usually when we're going to do a prescribed burn if it hasn't snowed yet,
Sure.
So
Do you think that people who are brand new to fire science have an advantage, and that when they look at what is now, they just say, oh, well, that's what is. Whereas someone who's been studying this for 10, 20 years sees this as very aberrant and is kind of influenced by what you think is going to happen based on what's happened before, which probably is not what's going to happen next.
yeah, I mean, in some respects, but any fire scientist and fire ecologist, we all study that historic range of variability. So we all know the history. We all know what it was. And, you end up having mentors both in academia and, once you move on from academia in the work field, you end up with people who can tell you those things. But it is nice to have a fresh eye, because sometimes I, go down a rabbit hole of, oh my God, this is terrible,
Right.
So it's nice sometimes to work with, grad students and others who have a different perspective and are looking for positive things and looking on how can we adapt to this, which obviously I'm doing as well, but it's nice to have that fresh blood, so to speak.
You talked about the career vector from academia to the workplace. Is that the normal path, or do we see people start out in the workplace and move over to academia?
Oh no, you're right. It absolutely works both ways. I yes, I have met several people who have been in suppression for 10 or 15 years and then ended up going back to school. And even someone I know who worked in prescribed fire for a while, and she has a math degree, and she's considering going back to school to learn more of the natural resources piece of things because she doesn't have that ecology focus, in terms of monitoring prescribed fire. Yes, she can put it on the ground, she has the operations skills, but to be able to monitor it and know what the impacts mean and why things are happening, she wants to get that ecology background, which I think is cool.
That is. So what's the crossover between real world skills, academic skills? Are we seeing them align well or more or insufficiently? What's your take on that?
I think it works great. I mean, it works great both ways. I was sort of a late bloomer. I personally did some prescribed fire, and I was a wilderness ranger at Yosemite. I sort of did some other things before I finished my undergrad, and granted, my undergrad was forestry. But, then by the time I went to grad school, I knew that I wanted to do fire, so there is that route of, finding fire early, but bringing some experience and some, applied knowledge into academia is also really good. That's one thing that, for example, the Joint Fire Science Program, the fire science exchanges, if you know about them, all across the country. I used to run the one in the Southwest. That whole idea of bringing science and management together so that we're both answering questions that actually need answering through our research, and so that the research is applicable, it's meaningful, and that we're working together to try to come up with the answers.
And what are the questions that are most pressing now? It seems to be an equal blend of fire science and and fire administration.
Yeah,
They both seem to be very much in flux right now.
there's
Who
also
are
a
the
lot of social science
There's
that
what?
there's also a lot of social science that is happening, that's really important because we can't do anything on the ground without the support of communities around us. You can't go in and do large thinning projects or large burns without first working with the community. And so understanding those interactions and perceptions and trying to learn how to communicate better, with our communities is super important. And I have dabbled, in social science, so I really appreciate my social science partners who know way more than I do when I dabble because I have help.
Hey, yeah, and there's one school of thought that says we're not going to get proper community engagement unless individuals are, you become more learned about fire science and fire behavior and
Mhm.
whatnot. And then there's another school of thought that says, well, yes, that may be true, but people have their own lives and their own careers and their own interests, and fire might not be one of them. And if you're waiting on the general population to educate themselves about fire, the community will have long burned down before you accomplish that. So, are there opportunities for public policy to be made by people who are experts without, mass buy-in from voters?
I mean, we already have made some of that policy in California. I'm actually not sure where you are. Your phone number said Austin, Texas. So
We're in Boulder.
oh, you're in Boulder. Okay.
Yeah,
So in
and I,
California, we have made some of those policy changes. We've and other states have as well. Wherever they have, a certified burn program. In California, we now have a certified burn boss that at the state level, because becoming a burn boss through the federal government is extremely long term. It takes a long time to get there, and to be able to do a small scale prescribed fire that's not highly complex, you don't need to be, a federal burn boss. You don't need that much training. And so California has created this state burn boss program. We now have some liability protection so that there is this state claims fund that anyone who is a certified burn boss has access to. We're also supporting cultural burning so that cultural burners can also have access to that liability fund. It's trying to put fire in the hands of more people. And yes, these people are qualified. They may not be a federal burn boss, but they're qualified to do the burns they're doing. And, someone like me who's not Indigenous certainly isn't, I have no way to say whether a cultural burner is qualified. That's up to them and their tribe, and that's kind of how the state of California has looked at it. We're not going to say who's qualified in there. We're expecting the tribe to be that qualification, and to make that call. So that is kind of the goal, is just putting fire in the hands of more people. And, across the West, obviously pre-colonization, Indigenous people were doing a ton of burning for a variety of reasons. And, even post-colonization, ranchers and farmers, would burn. I'm actually from New England, and I grew up, in a farm community, and my dad would burn every spring. And, those practices have fallen away, partly because of liability, partly because of, legislation and restrictions, from the government. So I think putting fire in the hands of more people will help. Someone can have another career and have help from a prescribed burn association or a local burn boss to burn their property. So there is, you can grow that interest that way. I'm hosting the second now Central Coast Good Fire Fair near Santa Cruz in October. We did it last year. The idea is to have sort of a science fair type environment where people can learn about good fire. We have booths and local organizations to talk about their relationship with fire. We have a couple local tribes, and we'll do a small demonstration burn. It's about 3/4 of an acre, so it's pretty small, but it's in redwood. So, it'll burn and smoke pretty well.
Right.
We weren't able to do the burn unit last year because we were in red flag. So we're hoping this year, it's October 11th. We're hoping this year, we're a few days later, that maybe we'll get, just a little bit of rain to temper it so that we can do our burn. But people are curious, in general. I think people are curious. They want to know more about what's going on and how their lands are being managed, especially people who are outdoorsy people, so that's what we're trying to do, is bring the community into it.
And you'll have food there, right?
Of course. We have 2 food trucks.
Wood-fired pizza.
Not the wood-fired pizza. We have a burger and sandwich truck, and a place called Pana, and it's Venezuelan food.
So we're not going with a fire theme on the food.
We're not going with a fire theme on it. But it's good food.
I'm curious about the phrase itself, cultural burning.
Mm-hmm.
Is it not just simply agricultural burning as routinely practiced by different cultures?
I mean,
is it cultural in that, like, there's a religious aspect to it or something like that? Or is it just,
I think it depends.
Just good land stewardship that we don't have and other cultures do?
I think we maybe used to have it, but I think it is. There are so many answers there. It depends on the tribe, right? It depends on the indigenous group. But they burned for so many reasons. Some of them were ceremonial, some were religious. Some of them were for basketry materials. Some of them were for food or medicine plants. Some of them were to move game. Some of them were to literally make themselves safer because they knew they were in a high fire risk environment. So there were a ton of reasons that they burned, but all of the evidence and all of the people who are still here shows that the scale at which they burned was just way more than we're doing now, and way more than is even burning under wildfire circumstances. So any of the acres of fires that we see in California is a fraction of what they used to burn. I mean, for example, on the Central Coast, there's almost no lightning here. The CZU fire in 2020 was a rare event. It was a lightning caused fire. It was actually like a mass lightning event along the Central Coast in 2020. but that's extremely rare. I've seen not a single bolt of lightning in 3 years that I've been here.
Wow.
So yeah, it's rare. And so when we see redwoods that have fire scars, every 8 to 20 years or whatever it is, depending on, where you are, we know that a lot of that was anthropogenic. We know that a lot of that was because of people. And there were so many reasons that they burned.
That's assuming that the weather conditions haven't changed.
In some respects, yes, but I mean the interesting thing is that oftentimes, with trees is the one thing that you can tell the season of the burn when you look at fire or tree rings. You can actually usually tell the season of the burn. Occasionally, if it was in the middle of a drought, it's tough to tell season, but usually you can. And so it actually shows they often burned, during the dry season, because that's the only time it would burn, right?
Right.
So, I'm sure they had some sort of small escaped fires, but it would go out once it hit a different fuel type, usually, and I know, for example, Wilder Ranch State Park near Santa Cruz, they burn that way now. They don't put in a lot of line. It happens to be a popular mountain biking park, and I mountain bike there, but they occasionally use trails as line, but they will burn grasslands and let it burn right up to the forest, and it just goes out because those fuels aren't available. That's the grass will burn, but the trees won't. And the indigenous people knew that,
Yeah, right. And I think the bulk of experience generated by indigenous burners is more vast than we give it credit for, and more subtle.
Yeah.
Right. Because if we simply say, oh, they burned a lot, we're going to burn a lot, and we don't know what to burn when, we could really be making things worse rather than better.
Sometimes, depending on the ecosystem, yeah. Like, chaparral is incredibly difficult to burn. And I don't know if we should be doing prescribed fire in chaparral. The return interval for chaparral in Southern California is pretty high. It anywhere from like 60 to 100 years, I think, is about the return interval for most chaparral. So, what they're seeing now is a conversion to invasive grasses because it's burning too frequently and it can't regenerate that fast.
Interesting. So when you look at what the public sees, like we have this massive wildfire issue, which they're not wrong about, and then you look at that from your perspective, where do you see the big opportunities, and what are the priorities for how we go about managing the level of and intensity of fire that we're experiencing now?
I would love to see entire communities. Firewise Community is a great program, but I would love to see larger communities take on the personal responsibility and the community responsibility, help their neighbors kind of thing, where they all they all really do the work. They all do their zone zero in California, which is that 0 to 5 foot zone. That is the only way that we can protect communities given some of the conditions that we've seen. If one person does it and nobody else does, or if only a few people do it, we really need to see entire communities do that. And I'd love to see, I gave a talk a few months ago for the California chapter of the American Planning Association. And those are the kind of people that we need to be talking to. We need to get in on the ground level, at least in the new communities. Yes, we need to retrofit the other communities, but we need to start changing the way that we build communities and changing the way that we think about that. Protecting one house isn't going to do it. It's when you have those wind-driven fires and there's even a little bit of fuel and a little bit of, that it's impossible to prevent it when you're doing it house by house. Yeah. So we really need to tackle it at the community level and at the neighborhood level.
Do you think of it as kind of an evolutionary force on housing? The environment has changed, the communities that are also able to change will survive, and those that don't will burn down. And then they will have opportunity to rebuild in a more fire compliant way.
Yeah, I mean it's incredibly hard post fire. You know, people want to get in as soon as possible. They want to rebuild. You know, they want to sort of get back to normal, and I
Right.
get that. The hard thing is it is more expensive to build, you know, to the code that is more fire resistant. And, you know, in California, it's only required in areas that are rated as high severity by the CAL FIRE maps. I would like to see it in, you know, a lot more areas. I would like to see it in some of the low to moderate, at least moderate to high and very high. I would like to
Moderate to be
see
high, you know, given a couple of years.
exactly. Yes,
Yeah.
it's changing. And that was kind of my spiel to the planners is, you know, even if you're building in a moderate zone now, you need to think in your head that could change in 5 to 10 years. So
Right. Within the lifespan of that house,
yes,
it will be rezoned, and it'll
it
be
very
out
well could be.
be
Yes.
out of date.
And
Something like that.
I mean, you know, the modeling that they use, nothing, it's a model, you know, nothing is perfect either. For example, I know my house, I think it's considered low. I back, you know, a down slope of, you know, an oak woodland that's open space. And, you know, we have off and on had, you know, unhoused people back there. And that's an ignition source. So I don't see myself as being in a low, you
Right.
know, a low risk area. I see myself as being in a moderate to high. So they're not perfect.
Yeah, right. They're what we've got.
Yeah.
But yeah. I went, you know, people in Boulder should be relatively fire conscious, right? Colorado had a
Yes.
lot of fire. We, you know, most of Boulder saw the Marshall Fire,
Mm-hmm.
breathed the smoke. I went for a walk last night, around 7 or 8 o'clock at night. And nice neighborhood, and I could not believe the number of houses that had trees touching them. Continuous
Yeah.
crown cover from house to house, from tree to tree. And it's as if these people never heard of wildfire or wildfire preparation.
Change is hard.
What's going on with people in their head that they would think that it's okay in this fire age for trees to be touching your house?
I do think a lot of people tune it out and, you know, they think it's not going to happen to me. You know, there are a lot of things that happen there. There's a lot of social science there, but you know, change is hard. Change can be expensive. I mean, in California, we have eucalyptus trees, which, ugh, they're a nightmare.
You had what?
Eucalyptus trees.
Oh yeah,
And, you know, they're extremely flammable
sure.
and they can get really huge. I mean, taking out a eucalyptus tree can be like $10,000.
You just get some koala bears.
Yeah, if only.
Other people.
And then they come back. You know, you have to like paint herbicide on them because
Oh
they're
wow.
just so resilient. So, you know, it can be expensive. It can be overwhelming. People don't know where to start. But, you know, coming into these communities, it has to kind of come from the community, you know? So in California, we have fire safe councils. And I mean, Firewise community is a national, you know, thing through the National Fire Protection Association. So that one's a good one. But I feel like you can only deal with your own neighborhood. And so, you know, I talk to my neighbors as a fire professional, and that's what I can do. Obviously, I talk to other neighbors if I'm invited,
Right.
but I don't necessarily, you know, I'll talk to homeowners association, like board members type, you know, I'll talk to CAL FIRE, and if they know someone where I should go in and talk to them, I'm not going to just walk up and knock on somebody's door. It has to be somebody who is already interested, and then we can try to bring in the rest of the community.
I see.
But, you know, it's you do listen to your neighbors generally, you know, and if your neighbor's doing it, you're a lot more likely to do it. But, you know, as far as zone 0 in California, people are a lot of, you know, worried, oh, I have to cut down all my trees. And there are some exceptions for trees. Yes, you don't want it touching your house. you want a buffer, right? But if the stem is, if the bole of the tree is within that 5 feet, you don't necessarily have to cut it. If it's trimmed properly, I mean, some of our old oak trees grow in sort of a funky shape anyway. And if it's kind of growing away from the house, it's fine. It's kind of a balance of what do those trees provide? Do they provide shade? Do they increase moisture? All of those things versus are they really a ladder fuel? If they're not trimmed, or are they putting, leaves in the gutter constantly, then you have to clean it. If you're not cleaning it, maybe consider taking it out. But it is a balance. I mean, the other thing is people want their privacy. And,
Right.
you see those juniper hedges or the cypress hedges.
Right. Ugh.
And, in the fire world, we all know that those are the first things to go. I mean, those are just
And they take
exceedingly
everything with them.
flammable.
Right.
And, but they block your neighbors from seeing into your yard. I mean, I get that desire for privacy. It's just, it is change is hard. It's not going to happen overnight. And, if you walk through that
Well,
neighborhood,
it is actually. It's just the changes that happen overnight aren't the kind you want.
they're the bad kind. Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly.
Right. Overnight, your neighborhood and all your trees and all your houses are gone. Ta-da.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
So if you're next time you walk through that neighborhood, if you know anybody, talk to them.
and if
Try
you
to create a
don't,
movement.
leave a little card on their door.
If you know them.
So, but when you see houses that are clearly owned by people that are either completely unaware of fire or in high fire denial, and you said that, the change has to come from the community. But if nobody in that community has the zeitgeist for that kind of change, then what? How do you reach them? Or do you don't? They just burn.
No, I mean, you do still try to reach them. You try to reach them through community events. And, for example, the Good Fire Fair that I told you about, we also have our Fire Safe Council that will be there, and they'll have a booth. Last year they did a short demonstration, which was a really good one because it's state parks. And so they have a lot of backlog maintenance, and they have the visitor center is this beautiful old cabin with a wood shake roof in the middle of a redwood forest in a highly flammable area. So, that's kind of their example of, look, this is beautiful, but XYZ, we need to change this and this and this and this. And they kind of point out all the things that need to be changed. And then, on the other side of the parking lot, State Parks has a new building that they built to code. It has an asphalt roof. It has, all of the things that it needs to have. And so talking about that difference and showing it through community events, obviously not everybody comes to community events, but putting those kinds of things in fun places, I think is a good way to, to get to people. I've also given presentations at, town halls for our state assembly member and for a mayor, up in Santa Clara County to try to, talk to people about this. And California is starting to allow some funding to help people do this in a match sort of way.
Okay.
So, I think it's not going to come from the feds right now, but at the state or county level, potentially,
Right.
I think if any community can help provide, some assistance, that goes a long way. Either if it's physical assistance or, financial assistance. Because I also do, home hardening workshops and defensible space workshops where we'll go into a neighborhood because one person wanted me to come, and then they invite all their neighbors.
Okay.
And, at the end of the workshop, we go down the street to the nice elderly couple who's been there for 50 years and can't really do their yard work anymore.
Right.
And we do a whole bunch of work in their yard. So, we get both the, instructional piece of it and then the physical piece of actually, this is what you need to do,
Yeah, right. And a lot of it is hard work.
Mm-hmm.
To what degree do you see a balance between vegetation removal and vegetation treatment? Is it possible in certain cases to leave the vegetation there, but treat it chemically so that it's not a fuel? It's not a
treat it
fuel.
chemically. Well,
I
if
mean,
you treat it chemically, it's still going to die. And then it's going to be dry.
Oh, I meant using, retardants that don't kill vegetation, but just render them less flammable.
I don't know much about those.
Okay.
Um, and I typically don't recommend any of those, just A, because I don't know much about them, but B, because not everybody can afford them.
Mm-hmm.
Even the home sprinkler systems and stuff,
Right.
they may be great, but you still need to do your defensible space work, because even if you have a sprinkler system and your neighbor's house is burning, it's probably, not going to do much. And then if the water gets turned off,
Right.
So,
Right. The idea that there's enough water for everyone to run their sprinkler at the same time during a fire, not too likely.
right.
Yeah. What are the other big challenges that you see that you would fix with your magic wand if you had one?
I would love to see, and I kind of alluded to this earlier, putting fire in more hands of people, good fire in the hands of more people. I would love to see communities just coming together to burn, even if it's like, I'm going to burn my, 1 acre backyard, where all the neighbors come over, they have a party, they burn their little 1 acre, and, they're in decent shape for, a few years, right?
Yeah.
Um, I'd love to see that happening at scale. I'd love to see neighbors helping neighbors. And I feel like, especially with, absentee homeowners and Airbnbs and, things like that, communities aren't as tight as they used to be. And, I don't know that there's an answer to that, but I feel like we need to do what we can still to within communities to work together. And I'm trying really hard in my neighborhood, and I
Yeah.
can say my neighbors put in palms in their backyard, and I'm like, oh, I
Right.
thought I said anything but a palm.
Yeah. If the tree has the last name oil, right? Palm oil, cedar oil, eucalyptus oil,
Yes.
coconut oil,
Yeah.
that should be a clue. Don't plant it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, I really would love to see, even nationally, I'd love to see that prescribed burn association model expand.
Yeah.
There is some of that happening in Oregon and Washington, but there's so much federal land in Arizona, New Mexico, and Colorado too. It's a little harder to do. There are some big private ranches in New Mexico, the Vermejo Ranch, the Ted Turner Ranch. I know they do some prescribed burning. There are some big ranches that do some of that, but they also end up having the funding, like Ted Turner, to bring in, private burn boss and be able to do that. But I'd love to be able to see that community model expand so that we all have a little bit of fire training. Maybe there's, one of us that's actually a burn boss, right? And then, we're all holding, we're all lighting. It's a small fire, it's low complexity. We can totally handle this,
Yeah.
it's not that hard. Yes, you need training, but I think people are just, afraid of it. When I was a kid, I was burning with my dad. We used to burn the meadow, and we literally had old garden hoses, stretched out, like 5 garden hoses put together. I mean, it was not it was not high tech, let me tell you.
No, it didn't have to be. Right. Yeah, when I did live in Texas, as you saw from my phone number,
Mhm.
we burned our land twice a year,
Mhm.
and it was a ritual. It was practically a religion to do it. And if I were to do the same thing here in Boulder, I'd be looking for, bail money to get out of jail.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So we need to work on that liability piece
Yeah.
and make training more accessible. And that's one of the things that's happening in California with the state, burn boss trainings that we're having and certification.
I
So I
see.
think we're up to like 45 or 50
That's pretty
California state burn bosses. Laney would have that number.
good. Okay.
But
And so
yeah.
when we think about, the danger of fire, it's really in many cases the danger of smoke, right?
Mm.
That if you're downwind of the smoke, that's really what what the big threat is
Mm-hmm.
medically, right?
Yes.
That very few people actually are consumed by the fire itself,
Mm-hmm.
whereas many more succumb to smoke. And we're starting to think that way also in terms of not just prescribed fire, but prescribed smoke.
Mm-hmm.
Can we convert these fuels into smoke that can be released at a controlled rate and a controlled distance
Mhm.
versus be overwhelmed by smoke when a fire comes through. Are you thinking in terms of the geography of perhaps a certain area doesn't pose a fire risk to the nearby community, and therefore you'd say, okay, well, we're not going to do a prescribed burn there, but because of the wind flows, it would be really beneficial to do a prescribed burn for the purpose of releasing the smoke, in advance of an unscheduled fire.
I haven't really thought of it that way, but we also, when we do prescribed fire, especially in California and on the Central Coast, we're also thinking about restoring fire to the ecosystem and restoring ecosystems in general. So it's not always about reducing wildfire risk. But yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. I mean, I do know when I was in Arizona, one highly impacted community, I swear, no matter, it was a sink. I mean, it was just a fire sink, was the Verde Valley and Sedona. Whenever there was a fire anywhere in the high country, it just, they got hammered. And, there were definitely smoke sensitive people down there with health issues and serious health issues sometimes. So even when there were prescribed fires in the high country, and sometimes, prescribed fire, at least in the Southwest, was typically in the fall, there would sometimes be weeks of prescribed fire smoke, and it wouldn't be anywhere near where they were.
Mm-hmm.
But just because of the topography, they always got hit by smoke. And that was a really hard one. I feel like one of the things that we need to do is work with our communities to provide them some options, whether it's pay for their hotel for a week, whether it's, sealing their house better and providing, air purification, any of those kinds of things. I've seen some air filtration loaner programs. There's always the DIY with the box fan, and the HVAC filter duct tape to it.
Right.
But I feel like we can't just say we need to burn this because we're restoring the ecosystem and we need to reduce fuels and blah, blah, blah. We need to take those people into account. And it's not an easy thing. It's definitely not an easy thing to communicate. Like, we do have to burn, but how can we help you deal with it? How can we help you survive this, essentially?
Right. No, it's sensitive.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like people are sensitive to the smoke. The question really is, whether you want to help people get through a little bit of smoke for a good reason, or an uncontrolled amount of smoke, because you're not willing to do the burns at all.
Right. And I did hear from the CZU fire when I first moved here, I did hear about, the year when the South Bay was completely socked in by smoke because of the CZU fire, because it burned for weeks. I think the final acreage was like 85,000 acres, something like that. But, it was burning in redwoods. It was burning Doug fir. It was burning chaparral. And some of those send up different smoke, like some of the chaparral species are very high in oils and things that can, put, I don't want to say more dangerous things, but, it's higher PM 2.5, depending on what's burning.
Yeah.
And so I definitely heard about that. It's not, it could totally happen again. And of course that ecosystem, it could burn again tomorrow because there's so much shrub that, there's so many shrubs that have come back.
Of course. Well, when we think about mutual aid treaties between different communities, and even the mutual aid that happens across international borders,
Mm-hmm.
People phrase it or think of it like, oh, we're going up there to help you with your fire.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, we're sending firefighters to Canada to help them with their fire problem. Their fire problem is our problem. Right? 120 million Americans are breathing Canadian smoke. If not for, goodwill, we should be going up to put those fires out for our own health.
Yeah, the issue in Canada is even I don't want to say it's more complicated, but there's so many ecosystems up there that are burning that never burned at the scale that they did. It's just incredible. It's the size of the fires up there
Massive.
are mind blowing.
They're
And
mind-blowing and enormous compared to the size of the resources that we're willing to dedicate to it.
true.
Right?
And they're
2,000
prescribed.
firefighters in your whole country.
Yeah, their prescribed burn, program, if you can call it that. They're not doing that much prescribed fire on the whole. And I know they're actually looking up to start up sort of a PFTC, prescribed fire training center. So they're hopeful that will change. I don't know that prescribed burning in the boreal forest is necessarily the right answer.
Maybe creating some separation.
I think that's what they're looking at, is at least creating some separation around communities.
Yeah.
But it's still a challenging take because their land management and their land ownership is so much different than ours. They have crown land, and then there are certified foresters that are allowed to manage that land. It's just a different animal in terms of they face similar issues but different.
But when there's both community and international impact from smoke, we just say, well, we're not going to stop the smoke coming across the border, because it's your fire, not ours, or it's on your private land or your federal land or whatever. If it was Ebola, we would never take such a hands-off approach.
Right.
We wouldn't tell some community in Africa that has active Ebola, well, you can fly within the country, you just can't fly to these other countries.
Yeah, it goes both ways. We occasionally send them our smoke.
Right.
They send us more smoke just because that's the way the airflow goes.
Right.
I'm sorry?
We have a smoke trade imbalance.
Yes. But it's just the, function of the atmosphere and the way the flows go,
Yeah.
It's not, we do occasionally send them smoke, but it's a global issue, and I do feel like we need to be working together, internationally to solve these problems, because a lot of the problems are similar.
Yeah. And so what are the international efforts that you're aware of?
I am actually doing a workshop at the IWF conference in October with some Canadian partners, all about forestry and fire outreach and helping communities to address their own problems and things like that. So that's one thing I'm doing. I also attended a conference a few years ago 2 years ago in Portugal.
Yes.
And that was a really interesting one. They, it's interesting how similar the issues are, but, trying to expand that prescribed fire model is still a big deal. They're not doing a lot of prescribed fire in Europe. For example, Spain is probably the most active country in prescribed fire, but the other countries are woefully behind. I don't think they really do any prescribed fire in France. And they fight fire differently in general. For example, France has the largest aviation fleet in all of Europe. They lend it out a lot, to Greece and to Spain and other countries. They don't fight fire on the ground like we do. They don't have like engine crews. They don't have hotshot crews. And, part of that is they don't have as much wilderness and as much open space as we do. But they take fewer risks, I think, although aviation is always a higher risk. So, right. But generally they fight fire mostly by air.
Mm-hmm.
It's really, they do have engines,
how
but
effective is it? I'm just curious.
Yeah.
I don't have an issue with it one way or the other, but you hear American firefighters say, doesn't matter. You could blanket the skies with aluminum and you still couldn't get a fire under control without boots on the ground. Now, whether this is true or not, I don't know.
It generally is.
You heard that. Yeah.
I always look at it like what I always tell people is air support is just that. It's support. Sometimes you can't do things on the ground without support, but they're not going to make as much of a difference if people aren't on the ground. But in Europe, it is a little different just because there are so many roads, So if they can slow it down as it comes into a road, and then they have people on the ground on the road because they don't go off, they stay with their engine.
Right.
Then they can stop it there. But it's just a different way of doing it, and they use more water than retardant. It's
That's
interesting.
Nice. I bet the fish appreciate that.
Yeah. But they also have more access to water there as well. Generally, they have a lot of reservoirs. It is a Mediterranean climate in the south where more fire is, but there's generally more water there.
Well, they've been occupying those areas for thousands of years, right? And have built hamlets and townships pretty much everywhere.
Yes.
And so really, they have to have better firefighting because 100-kilometer fire in Europe is going to move through many cities, and
Right.
100-kilometer fire in the United States, could run 10,000 kilometers and still not run into the first house.
Right.
Got a lot more, undeveloped land here.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the other interesting thing is most of their houses are stone.
Yes.
And
if you don't build with fuel.
Yeah. Their WUI issues are different because they don't, they have tile, generally, at least in the South, they have tile roofs and stone buildings. And it's just less flammable. So, and they're also not that close together unless you're in a village where they're touching.
Right.
But they haven't had that conflagration that we have. So I do think a lot of that is because of, the building materials.
Yeah. And why aren't we building out of non-flammables?
It's expensive.
As far as I know, asphalt is made of oil.
True. Yeah. But it's expensive, to build out of stone.
But you do it once.
True.
You never have to fix termite damage. Right. You don't get black mold growing in the walls.
You could get black mold growing in the walls.
You could, huh? Okay.
Have you been in some of those old stone houses in Europe?
You're right. They can get pretty musty.
Yeah.
They sure can. Well, fascinating. I'm so impressed with the work you're doing and the way you're bridging that gap between the real world, the academic world, and the social science piece of it. So I encourage folks to attend your next fire fair. What are you calling it, and where can people
Central Coast Good Fire Fair.
The Central Coast?
The Central Coast Good Fire Fair, and it'll be in Felton.
Wonderful. Well, I hope folks show up there. We'll spread the word. If you've got a brochure,
sure,
zip it over to me, and we'll post it as well. And
great.
Thanks so much for joining me on the show today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Barb Wolfson, live from California. And you've been listening to and watching, hopefully, The Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf. We had Barb Wolfson join us today. We're sponsored by Team Wildfire. And go out there and do some good work. Go to a fire fair. That sounds like fun.